At the Oak Ridge Country Club's annual gala, the air conditioning was cranked so high it felt like an icebox, but my soon-to-be ex-son-in-law was sweating bullets. Julian Vance was the kind of man who built his entire life on a shaky foundation of maxed-out credit cards and performative noise. He stood in the center of the ballroom, his rented tuxedo shimmering under the crystal chandeliers, a man playing dress-up in a fairy tale he couldn't possibly afford. I was tucked away in the shadows near the kitchen entrance, wearing the only suit I'd kept in my closet. It was a charcoal gray wool blend from the 90s, still carrying a faint scent of mothballs and cedar. I watched my daughter Claire from a distance. She looked stunning in a gown that probably cost more than the down payment on my first house. She seemed happy enough, but her eyes were darting around nervously, flicking between Julian, the elite guests, and, occasionally, me, with a look of pure reluctance. She was embarrassed. I could tell by the way she stiffened every time she steered her friends away from my direction. To her and to everyone else in this room, I was just Arthur, the retired old man who lived in a ramshackle cabin on the edge of the woods, drove a rusted-out Ford truck, and spent his afternoons on the porch fixing broken radios. Julian waved at me. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. He was sitting at the VIP table, reserved for the heavy hitters of his world. One of the men at that table was someone I knew very well, though he hadn't seen me in 5 years. It was Richard Hayes, the current CEO of Pendleton Logistics, the man I'd personally handpicked and mentored to take over my business empire when I decided to step back. "Get over here, Arthur," Julian shouted, his voice cutting through the soft jazz. "I want you to meet someone." I started walking, keeping it slow. My knees were aching, a reminder of the years I spent hauling freight in the pouring rain before I ever owned a single shipping container. As I approached the table, Julian stood up and threw a heavy arm around my shoulders. It felt like a trap. He smelled like a toxic mix of expensive scotch and raw arrogance. "Mr. Hayes," Julian said, dripping with that greasy, fake flattery, "I'd like to introduce you to my father-in-law, Arthur. He's quite a character." Richard Hayes looked up from his ribeye, his eyes narrowing behind his gold-rimmed glasses. He was trying to place my face, but the gray beard I'd grown and the 20 pounds I'd shed since retirement were serving as a perfect disguise. Julian didn't wait for a response. He gripped my shoulder tighter, hard enough to leave a bruise on my old bones. "Arthur's a simple man, lives out in the woods, hasn't held a real job in years. We try to help him out, you know. Throw him a bone every now and then, but frankly, he's a total washout. I told Claire we had to invite him out of pity. Can you believe he drove a truck that sounds like a lawnmower to a place like this?" A few people at the table chuckled nervously. Claire was standing just a few feet away, staring at the thick carpet. She didn't defend me. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, letting her husband paint her father as a charity case, all to feed his own pathetic ego in front of his boss. A cold fire started burning in my chest. It wasn't rage. It was absolute clarity. For months, I'd suspected Julian wasn't the big shot he claimed to be. I knew he was a regional sales director for Richard, but his lifestyle didn't match his salary. The downtown penthouse, the new Porsche, the $200,000 gala, it was all a facade. He told everyone he was the company's golden boy, the rainmaker. Now, listening to him mock me, I realized he wasn't just a fraud. He was a fool. I looked at Richard. The CEO had stopped eating. He was staring right at me, his fork frozen in midair. The spark of recognition was dawning in his eyes. He looked at my worn-out suit, my face, and finally his gaze settled on the class ring on my right hand, the one I'd had custom-made for my 5 top executives when the company first hit $1 billion in revenue. Richard was wearing an identical one. "Arthur," Richard whispered, his voice trembling, "is that you?" Julian laughed, completely oblivious to the sudden chill in the room. "Yeah, that's him. Don't worry, Mr. Hayes, he won't be asking you for a job. He's too busy staring at the wall from his front porch." I didn't say a word. I just reached up and adjusted my tie, a very specific knot I'd taught Richard to tie decades ago, right before a massive Wall Street merger. I locked eyes with him and gave him the slightest, most subtle nod. It was an order. It was the exact same look I'd used in the boardroom to tell him to pull the plug on a bad deal. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor, silencing the table. He didn't look at Julian or Claire, he only looked at me. In that split second I saw the sheer terror in his eyes, the look of a man who suddenly realized he'd let a scavenger into the lion's den. "Mr. Vance," Richard said, his voice ice-cold and loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Julian kept his signature smirk, thinking he was about to get a pat on the back. "Yes, boss?" "You just referred to this gentleman as a jobless failure," Richard said, every word hitting like a gavel. "Ah, just a joke, boss," Julian said, waving a hand dismissively, trying to lighten the mood. "This isn't a joke to me," Richard replied, his face draining of color. "This man is not a failure. He is the reason you have a job today, or more accurately, the reason you had a job." Julian's smile melted away as if it had been hit with hot oil. "What?" "You're fired," Richard said, slicing the air with his hand. "Effective immediately. You're being terminated for gross misconduct, a total lack of judgment, and, frankly, for being an irredeemable idiot." The music seemed to stop. The sound of silverware clinking vanished. 200 guests turned their heads toward the VIP section. Julian stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a deck. "Fired?" Julian stammered. "You can't fire me. This is my event. I'm your top salesman." "You're a liability," Richard spat back. "If you ever show this man a shred of disrespect again, I'll make sure you never work in this industry as long as you live. Now get out of my sight." Richard turned to me and gave a slight, respectful bow. It was the salute of a soldier to his general. I kept my face blank. I didn't want to blow my cover here and now. I wanted Julian to suffer in the confusion. Julian looked at Richard, then at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. His brain couldn't process the reality. In his mind, it was all my fault. I was the bad luck, the permanent stain on his perfect image. Claire gasped, clutching her hands to her mouth. The champagne glass she was holding slipped, shattering against the marble. That sharp, violent sound shattered the spell over the room. I looked at Julian, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. I reached out, took a glass of red wine from a passing waiter's tray, and took a slow, deliberate sip. "This wine is sour," I said calmly, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "Much like your manners, Julian." Julian lunged at me like a madman, his hands clawing for the lapels of my old suit. "You did this!" he shrieked, spit flying. "You miserable old man! What did you say to him? You've ruined everything!" Richard had clearly alerted security. 2 men in dark suits stepped in, pinning Julian before he could reach me. He thrashed in their grip, screaming at me, at the world, at everyone but himself. I turned my back on him. I walked to the table, picked up a linen napkin, and wiped a speck of dust from my cuff. The vanity of the gala was over, but the real challenge had just begun. And Julian Vance had no idea he'd just declared war on the man who built the very ground he was standing on. The reality of the situation didn't bring Julian back to his senses. It sent him into a total spiral. For a narcissist of his caliber, admitting he'd made a catastrophic error was harder than believing the whole world had gone insane. He stood there, chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between Richard and me. "You're kidding, right?" Julian let out a dry, hysterical laugh that made the guests nearby instinctively step back. "This is a test, isn't it, boss? You're testing how I handle pressure. I can handle it. That's a great joke. You really had me going there." Richard didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Julian with the clinical indifference of a scientist pinning a bug to a board. "I'm not joking, Mr. Vance. You are finished. Leave this venue immediately, or I will have the police drag you out for trespassing." That was the final spark in the powder keg. Julian let out an inhuman growl, broke free from one of the guards, and lunged, not at me, but at the man who had stripped away his future. "You can't do this to me," he screamed, his hands grasping at the air just inches from Richard's throat. "I've made this company millions. I'm the star here." The second security guard tackled Julian from behind, the momentum sending them both crashing into a nearby buffet table filled with seafood towers and ice sculptures. The sound of shattering glass and clattering metal exploded through the ballroom like a bomb. Ice slid across the polished floor, and red cocktail sauce splattered onto the silk gowns of the horrified guests. This isn't some high society gala anymore. It's a full-blown street fight. Claire stood frozen in the middle of the room, watching the man she adored turn into a total monster. She looked at me, her eyes begging me to step in, to stop the madness. But I didn't budge. I just took another sip of that bitter wine. This was a lesson she needed to see firsthand. She needed to finally see the face behind that expensive mask. Finally, security pinned Julian to the floor. His white tuxedo was covered in red sauce, making it look like a crime scene. He was gasping for air, shouting at the ceiling, his fake sense of superiority completely stripped away. The guests started whispering, and some even pulled out their phones to record. The image of the perfect power couple was shattered, leaving behind nothing but an aggressive, unemployed man and a terrified wife. Then the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open. The country club manager walked in with 2 assistants, their tablets in hand. He looked at the overturned tables and the total chaos, his face turning dark. "Mr. Vance," the manager's voice cut through Julian's shouting like a blade. "We have a serious problem." Julian was hauled up by security, but he shoved them off, his face bright red. "What now? Can't you see I'm busy?" "We've received dozens of complaints from other members," the manager said, calm and collected. "On top of that, you've caused major property damage. Your behavior is a direct violation of our venue contract. I'm shutting this event down, effective immediately." "Shutting it down?" Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You can't do that. I paid a fortune for tonight." "Actually," the manager checked his tablet, "you only paid the deposit. The remaining $30,000 was due after the event. But given the breach of contract and the damages, I'm activating the immediate payment clause. I need that balance paid in full right now, or I'm calling the police to file charges for property damage and theft of services." $30,000. The number hung in the air. The music had long stopped, and the only sound was the humming of the AC and Claire's muffled sobbing. Julian looked at the manager, then at the security guards looming nearby, and finally at the exit. He realized he was cornered. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim one last shred of vanity. "Fine. Great. I'll pay your ridiculous bill, and then I'm suing you for ruining my evening." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek metal wallet, and whipped out a black credit card like he was brandishing a weapon. "Here, take it. Add a tip for yourself while you're at it. Maybe use it to buy some professionalism." The manager took the card without a word and signaled his assistant to bring over a mobile card reader. He punched in the $30,000 and handed the machine to Julian. Julian pressed the keys hard, staring at me with pure hatred the entire time. "Watch this, old man," he sneered. "This is real power." The machine let out a sharp, flat beep. The screen flashed red. "I'm sorry, sir, the transaction was declined," the manager said coldly. Julian's face went ghost white. "Try it again. It's a platinum card. There's no limit." The manager tried again. Beep, declined. Julian grabbed his wallet and pulled out another card. "Try this one." Beep, declined. A third card. Beep, still declined. Julian was drenched in sweat now. He started pounding on the machine, as if he could force the money out of it. "There's a mistake. Your system must be down." "The system is fine, sir," the manager said, his voice dropping low. "Your cards are either maxed out or frozen. Do you have another way to pay?" Julian turned sharply to Claire. "What about your card?" Claire shook her head, tears welling up. "You made me leave my purse in the suite. I don't have anything on me." Julian looked around. His so-called investment banker friends were staring at the carpet, and his parents were nowhere to be found. He was stranded, facing a $30,000 debt and the very real threat of jail time. Then his eyes locked onto mine. A twisted idea formed in his desperate mind. He stomped over to me, invading my personal space, his breath reeking of defeat. "You," he hissed through clenched teeth, "you pay it." I looked at him calmly. "Say that again?" "This is your fault," Julian roared, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're the one who got me fired. You started this whole mess. You're Claire's father. Traditionally, the father of the bride pays for these things. So, you pay." He pointed at my old suit, at my worn-out shoes. I know you've got some retirement fund tucked away under a mattress somewhere. Dig it up. Write a check. I don't care how you do it. But if you don't clean up this mess, you aren't leaving this room. He grabbed my lapels, his eyes bloodshot, like a gambler who had lost everything. Pay up, old man, or I swear to God you'll never see your daughter again. I reached into my worn wool jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate, drawing everyone's eyes. Julian held his breath, his pupils dilated with greed and relief. He thought he'd won. He thought his intimidation tactic had worked, and that this weak old man was finally going to pull out a checkbook to save him. I saw Claire's shoulders relax, too. She let out a shaky breath, fully believing her father would pay for her marriage's disaster, just like always. She looked at me with gratitude, but underneath that, I saw the sense of entitlement. She expected me to pay because I always did. I pulled out a cream-colored envelope. The edges were a bit frayed. I held it out to Julian. Here you go, I said softly. Julian snatched it like a starving dog grabbing a bone. He didn't even say thank you. He tore the seal open with trembling fingers, desperate for the check that would save his pathetic pride. He pulled out the contents. It wasn't a check. It wasn't cash. It was a greeting card, a plain one with a sailboat on the front. Julian stared at it, turning the envelope upside down and shaking it, hoping something else would fall out. Nothing. He opened the card and saw the note I'd written over coffee that morning. Independence is the greatest gift a father can give his child. Wishing you both a new beginning. Julian snapped his head up to look at me, his expression twisted in disbelief. Is this a joke? He threw the card to the floor. What kind of sick game is this? I need $30,000, and you give me a damn greeting card? It's not a joke, I replied steadily. It's a lesson. You always brag about being a self-made success, Julian, and you call me a failure. A failure can't help a winner. You're on your own now. Claire rushed over, grabbing my arm, her nails dug into my sleeve. Dad, please, you can't do this. The manager is going to call the police. They'll arrest him. Please, pay the money. I know you have savings. I know you have the life insurance money Mom left behind. Just give it to him, for me. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the woman I'd tried so hard to teach to be strong, independent, and kind. But all I saw was a stranger. She would rather drain her own father dry than stand up to the jerk who just humiliated him in front of everyone. I've paid enough, Claire. My voice went cold. She shook her head wildly. You haven't paid for anything. You just gave us a piece of paper. I haven't paid, I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. Let me refresh your memory in front of everyone, my dear daughter. Last year, when Julian forgot to pay the loan on his red Audi for 4 months, who do you think covered that? It wasn't the bank being generous. It was me. Claire went rigid. Her eyes widened. And who do you think paid the down payment on that luxury condo in downtown Portland? I continued, my voice loud enough to cut through the whispers. You told everyone it was Julian's year-end bonus, and Julian told everyone he was a real estate genius. But that check was mine. I sent it anonymously through a trust to the closing attorney, just so you wouldn't end up on the street. Julian took a step back, like he'd been slapped across the face. He knew. He'd always suspected, but his arrogance wouldn't let him admit that his lavish lifestyle was being subsidized by the man he despised the most. And the credit card debt, I said, staring straight into Julian's eyes. The $50,000 you lost on an offshore betting site last Christmas, plus the margin call on your stocks. You told Claire you won the lottery. There was no lottery. I was the one who contacted your broker and settled with those debt collectors, because I didn't want to see guys with baseball bats showing up at my daughter's door. I took a step toward them. In the last 2 years, I've spent $200,000 cleaning up your messes. I stayed in the shadows because I wanted to give you some dignity. I wanted to give you a chance to stand on your own. But today, you proved you don't need dignity. You need a servant, a human ATM, that spits out cash whenever you demand it. Claire was openly crying now, her makeup running. Dad, stop it. Please, everyone is listening. You're embarrassing us. I'm not embarrassing you, I said coldly. You've done that all by yourselves. You introduced me as a failure, a burden. Well, congratulations. From this moment on, the burden is gone, and your private bank is officially closed." Julian wiped the sweat from his face, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He saw security closing in and the manager checking his watch. He needed a lifeline, and he realized he had one last card to play. "Claire," he growled, "use the emergency card. The one your dad gave you for medical emergencies. It has a high limit. Use it." Claire looked at me, then at Julian. She hesitated. "Do it!" Julian screamed hysterically, "or I'm going to jail." Claire shakily reached into the hidden pocket of her clutch. She pulled out a silver credit card. It was a secondary card linked to my private trust account. When I gave it to her 5 years ago, I told her it was for life-or-death medical emergencies only. She'd never used it, until now. She walked toward the manager, her hands trembling. "Here," she said in a whisper. "Try this." I didn't stop her. I didn't grab the card. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It wasn't a smartphone. It was a rugged, encrypted device made for secure communication. It looked like an antique, like the brick phones construction workers used in the early 2000s. Julian saw the phone and let out a scoff. "Look at that. The old man is using a dinosaur to call for help." I didn't even look at him. I entered a short code, a direct command to my private bank's mainframe, a kill switch for these accounts. I hit send. The manager took the card. He swiped it. We waited. I watched the machine. I watched the red light flicker. "Transaction declined," the manager said coldly. Claire gasped. "That's impossible. My father said there was a $50,000 limit. Try it again." The manager swiped it again. "Declined. The card is flagged as lost or stolen, and the bank system is requiring me to confiscate it immediately." The manager tucked the plastic card into his pocket without a second thought. Claire turned to look at me, her face full of shocked betrayal. "Dad, what did you do?" I put the brick phone back in my pocket and patted my leg. "I cut your safety net, Claire," I said. "You chose him. You chose a man who mocks your father in public. You chose a man who blows money he never earned. You chose a man who values vanity more than character. If that's what you want, you'll have to face the consequences together. That's what marriage is." Julian let out a desperate roar and tried to lunge at me, but security was ready. They pinned him to the wall and slapped on plastic zip-tie handcuffs before he could take 2 steps. "This is assault!" Julian screamed as they dragged him toward the exit. "I'll sue you! I'll sue the club! I'll sue everyone!" The manager waved to his staff. "Call the police and get the legal team's list of damages ready." I straightened my jacket and glanced at Richard Hayes. He was watching the scene with a cold sense of satisfaction. He gave me a nod, a silent confirmation that justice had been served. I walked past Claire. She tried to grab my hand, but I stepped aside. "Dad, wait," she sobbed. "They took the car keys. How are we supposed to get home?" "Take the bus," I said without looking back. "It builds character." I walked out of the ballroom, the heavy double doors closing behind me and cutting off Julian's screaming and my daughter's crying. I walked through the grand lobby and out into the cool night air. My rusted Ford pickup was sitting in the valet line, right next to a Bentley and a Mercedes. The young valet held out my keys, looking at me with a confused expression. "All set, sir?" he asked. I took the keys and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine gave a rough, sputtering roar as it came to life. It was the sound Julian hated most. I smiled. It was the sound of freedom. I drove away from the country club, leaving all the chaos in the rearview mirror. I knew the hardest part was yet to come. They would come for me. They would try to take my land. And for that, I was ready. 3 days passed in a dead silence, the kind of heavy, still air you feel right before a tornado touches down in Oregon. For those 3 days, I just sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar and watching the driveway. I knew Julian wouldn't just give up. People like him, stripped of their vanity and their paycheck, don't just vanish. They explode like a dirty bomb. I just didn't know when the shrapnel would hit. Tuesday afternoon, they showed up. A black SUV came flying up my gravel driveway, kicking up a storm of dust that coated my freshly washed truck. It didn't park neatly. It skidded to a stop just inches from my porch steps, a totally defiant gesture. Julian jumped out of the driver's seat. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 72 hours. His once expensive shirt was wrinkled, and his tie was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, and every movement had that twitchy, manic energy of an addict looking for their next fix. Claire climbed out of the passenger side. She looked more withered than I'd ever seen her. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes fixed on the dirt, as if looking at me would burn her. Julian didn't knock. He kicked my front door open, the old wood groaning and splintering at the lock. The sound echoed through the small cabin like a gunshot. He stormed into my living room, reeking of cheap cigarettes, stale sweat, and sheer, hopeless desperation. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you, old man?" he shrieked, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you can ruin my life, and then sit in this dump whittling your stupid wood?" I slowly stood up from my armchair, my fingers tightening on the handle of my pocket knife. "Get out of my house, Julian." "This isn't a house," he spat, pacing the small living room. "This is a slum, a termite-ridden shack. I don't know how Claire survived growing up in a dump like this." He suddenly grabbed a ceramic vase from the mantelpiece. It was a simple blue piece, imperfect, even a little asymmetrical. My wife, Eleanor, had made it by hand 40 years ago when we took a pottery class together. It was one of the few traces she had left in this world. "Don't touch that," I warned him. My voice dropped into a dangerous low rumble, like a beast growling in its throat. Julian locked eyes with me, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, and then he let go. The ceramics shattered against the hardwood floor into 100 pieces. He even made a point of stepping forward, grinding his heel into the shards, crushing my wife's memory into the dust. "Oops, slipped," he sneered. Then he grabbed a photo frame from the side table. It was the last picture taken of Eleanor before cancer took her life. She was sitting in the garden, wearing her favorite sun hat, smiling so peacefully. "And this garbage," Julian roared, "belongs in the trash." He hurled the frame through the open door. It landed face down in the mud of the front yard. My heart hammered against my ribs with a ferocity I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to pounce on him, to pin him down, to break his nose. But I nailed my feet to the floor. Violence was his language. If I attacked him physically, he would win the role of the victim in the eyes of the law. I had to break him in my own way. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slammed it down onto my small wooden dining table with enough force to make the pepper shaker jump. "Read it," he commanded. I didn't move. "Tell me what it is." "It's a lawsuit." Julian puffed out his chest as if handing down a verdict. "Defamation, lost income, emotional distress, and tortious interference with business contracts. I'm suing you, Arthur, for $5 million. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. $5 million, I repeated calmly. "You can't even scrape together 500, Julian. Once the court strips you bare, I'll have 5 million, he yelled. "You lied to Hayes. You slandered me. You've ruined my reputation in this town. I can't even get an interview now. Nobody will hire me. You took everything from me, so now I'm taking everything from you." I looked at Claire. She had been standing in the doorway, refusing to look at the shattered vase or the picture in the mud. She was shaking. "Claire," I said softly, "is this what you want?" She didn't answer. She just wrapped her arms tightly around herself, as if the room had turned into an icebox. "Don't talk to her," Julian snapped, stepping between us. "She's on my side. We're in this together. And we know for a fact that you don't have 5 million in liquid assets. We know you're a total pauper, but you have one other thing." He pulled another document from his pocket. It was a crumpled, coffee-stained piece of paper. He smoothed it out on the table, right next to the ridiculous lawsuit. "This land," he gestured wildly at his surroundings, "it's the only asset you have that's worth anything. I checked the county records. You hold the title free and clear. No mortgage. This place might be a dump, and this shack should have been condemned years ago, but developers are buying up land along the highway." He poked the paper with a trembling finger. It was a standard quitclaim deed. "Sign it," he demanded. "Transfer the deed to me, unconditionally. I can flip it fast. It won't bring 5 million, but it'll get me enough cash to pay off the loan sharks who are looking for my kneecaps, and hire a real lawyer to go after Hayes." I slowly walked to the table and looked down at the deed. He wanted my home, the place where I raised my daughter, the place where I spent my final days with my wife, the sanctuary I found after stepping away from the noise of the corporate world. "You want me to sell my home to pay off your gambling debts and margin calls?" I asked. "This isn't a home!" Julian screamed, his face turning beet red. "This is a pile of mud with a roof over it. Look at it. It's pathetic, just like you. Sign it, old man. If we're lucky, this scrap of land might fetch 50,000. That's enough to keep my legs safe for another week." I let out a short, dry laugh that vibrated in my chest. "You think this land is only worth 50,000? I asked. "It's all mud and weeds," he scoffed. "What else could it be worth?" I picked up the deed and glanced at the legal description. He hadn't even read the document carefully. He only saw a dilapidated cabin and a gravel driveway. "Julian," I began, my voice steady and cold, "you see a broken shack and a weed-choked garden. You only see what's under your nose. But you never check the county land surveys or the latest files from the Planning Commission." I stepped forward, forcing him to look up to meet my eyes. "This cabin sits on 120 acres of private property," I revealed. 40 years ago, when everyone said Portland's municipal growth would never reach this far, I bought up every surrounding parcel. I hold the timber rights. I hold all the water rights to the deep underground aquifer. And most importantly, as of last year, the city rezoned this entire area for commercial development, specifically for a data center. Julian's eyes nearly popped out of his head. His mouth hung open. "This land isn't worth 50,000, I said, staring at his twisted face. "Its latest commercial valuation's $12 million. Dead silence followed. Even Claire, who had been staring at the floor, snapped her head up in shock. Julian stared at me, and then he looked at this cabin with new eyes. The disgust and disdain vanished instantly, replaced by a hungry, fanatical greed. He looked like a starving wolf who had just stumbled into an open slaughterhouse. "12 million, he whispered. "You're sitting on $12 million and living like a beggar. You drive that piece of junk truck, you wear clothes with holes in them, and you've got 12 million buried in the dirt. I live this way because I choose to," I said coldly, "because my memories are here, because my wife is buried under that old oak tree in the backyard. You only see price tags, Julian, but I see a sanctuary. I won't sell an inch of this land, and I certainly won't use it to save a vampire like you." Julian's shock curdled into anger, but this time it was laced with intense jealousy. He pulled a pen from his pocket and shoved it into my chest. "Sign it," he hissed like a viper. "Sign it now. You owe us. You owe Claire. You've been sitting on this fortune while watching us struggle in financial ruin. You're selfish. You're evil. Sign the paper, old man, or I swear I'll burn this place to the ground with you inside it." "Never," I said. Julian flew into a rage, hurling the pen across the room. It bounced off the wall and fell into the fireplace. He paced frantically, tearing at his hair and muttering to himself. He looked at the lawsuit, then the deed, then at me. He realized he couldn't physically force me to sign. But then his eyes lit up with a darker, more wicked idea. "Fine. Great. You want to play hardball?" Julian nodded maliciously, backing toward the door. "You want to protect your priceless sanctuary. Let's see how tough you are when the county declares you an incapacitated lunatic, and the court forces you to forfeit your property rights." He grabbed Claire by the arm and dragged her roughly out of the cabin. "Let's go, Claire!" Claire stumbled, looking back at me with eyes full of pain and confusion, but she didn't fight back, letting Julian shove her into the SUV. "Get ready for hell, Arthur!" Julian shouted through the open window before starting the engine. "I'll prove you're a delusional old psycho. I'll get an emergency conservatorship. This land will be mine eventually." The SUV roared down the gravel road, fishtailing onto the main highway and disappearing into a cloud of dust. I stood on the porch alone, looking at the muddy photo in the yard. The forest was quiet, but I knew Julian had already planted the poison. Since he couldn't steal my property in the real world, he intended to exploit the loopholes in the legal system to declare me mentally unfit, stripping me of my rights as an adult. The storm was coming, a war far dirtier than anything before, fought in the shadows of courthouses and medical records. I bent down, picked up my wife's photo, and gently wiped the mud off with my thumb. The seeds of doubt Julian planted in Claire's mind took root instantly. He didn't give her time to think, let alone confront me. He isolated her in their rented apartment in downtown Portland, bombarding her with fear and lies. I wasn't there to defend myself, but I knew exactly what he said. because Claire later recounted every word through tears of shame. Julian paced their living room, waving the phone I'd cut off, acting like a victim in a low-budget horror movie. "He's lost it, Claire," he roared, his voice dripping with fake panic. "Did you hear the insane things he said in that cabin? $12 million? Data centers? He's not just a hoarder. He's suffering from severe paranoia and delusions of grandeur. It's textbook, late-stage Alzheimer's." He leaned in close, delivering his most toxic lie. He even threatened to stab me today and burn that cabin down just to protect his imaginary fortune. "Do you want a call at 3 a.m. from the Oregon police telling you your father was burned alive? We're the only ones who can save him. He's sick, baby. He's so sick he doesn't know who he is anymore. That's why he humiliated us at the banquet. That's the disease talking." Claire broke down. She was exhausted, facing bankruptcy, and terrified. She loved me, and Julian was using that love as a weapon against me. She agreed to sign the papers and apply for an emergency conservatorship. It was 2 a.m. I wasn't asleep. I was sitting in the dark, drinking a cold cup of coffee. I knew they were coming even before the headlights cut through the mist of the Oak Ridge forest and the tires hit the gravel. It wasn't a police cruiser or a standard ambulance. It was a white, unmarked van with tinted windows. Julian hadn't contacted the county social services because that would require a long legal process and a real medical evaluation. He'd hired a private patient transport service, the kind of gray market agency that asks no questions as long as the check clears. I stood up and put on my tweed jacket. I knew I couldn't resist physically. If I pulled out my hunting rifle or raised a fist, I'd only provide Julian with the perfect evidence for his narrative, proof that I was indeed violent and unstable. I had to play a different game. I walked to the safe in my study, entered the code, and pulled out a small silver USB flash drive. I'd prepared it days ago for exactly this moment. I hid it in my palm and let it slide up my sleeve. The front door was kicked open. No knocking, no warning. 2 men in blue scrubs walked in. They were the size of professional linebackers, their faces locked in a mechanical, indifferent expression. Julian followed close behind with a clipboard. Claire was last, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with stifled sobs. "Mr. Arthur," the leader walked toward me, his tone stiff. "We're taking you to a safe place." I didn't move. I looked past him at Julian. "You're a coward, Julian. You couldn't win a fair fight, so you have to use low-life tactics to lock me away." Julian avoided my eyes. He turned to Claire and held out the clipboard and pen. "Sign it, honey. The private doctor already signed the evaluation, and we have the judge's temporary authorization. We have to do this now before he hurts himself." Claire looked up at me. Her eyes were full of fear and sorrow. "Dad, please. It's for your own good. You're sick. We just want to help you." "I'm perfectly lucid, Claire," I said calmly. "And he's been lying to you the entire time." "See?" Julian yelled, pointing at me. "He's showing classic signs of paranoia. He thinks everyone is lying to him. Sign it, Claire. Sign it now." Claire's hand trembled violently. The scratch of the pen on the paper sounded like a gavel striking down, sentencing me to lose my freedom. The moment the ink dried, the 2 men moved. They didn't let me walk. They grabbed my arms on either side with an iron grip. I tensed my muscles, anchoring my feet like nails into the floor. "I can walk myself," I said. "He's resisting," Julian immediately shouted. "Sedate him!" One of the attendants pulled a pre-filled syringe from his pocket. Without hesitation, he plunged the needle through my coat and into my shoulder. I felt a sharp sting, followed by the cold, numbing sensation of chemicals hitting my bloodstream. "You didn't have to do this," I gritted out as my legs began to feel heavy. Julian smiled. It was the arrogant, satisfied grin of a winner. As the drugs began to pull my consciousness under, he walked up to me and whispered, so only I could hear, "This is for the best, Arthur. You get a padded room, I get your medical power of attorney, I get the land, I get the money, and Claire, she'll always think she saved her poor, crazy dad. Everyone wins." My vision started to blur. The room tilted. The attendants dragged me toward the door. My feet dragged uselessly on the floor. I fought the darkness consuming my brain because I had one last move to make. Before I was completely erased from the system, I had to play my final card. Claire was standing by the doorframe, crying, unable to look at me. I intentionally went limp, turning into dead weight, forcing the attendants to stop and adjust their grip. It brought me within inches of Claire. I summoned my last ounce of control, reached out with my right hand, the one hiding the flash drive, and grabbed the hem of her jacket. She flinched, looking down at me. She thought I was going to scream, curse, or beg. I did neither. In the split second the attendants weren't looking, I slid the silver drive into her open pocket. My fingers brushed the back of her hand. She froze, feeling the cold object slip in. I looked up at her. My tongue was thick and stiff from the sedative, and the world was turning into a gray fog. But I forced my eyes to focus on hers one last time. "Don't cry," I mumbled. "Watch it. You can cry after you see what I've given you." Claire furrowed her brow, her hand instinctively reaching into her pocket. She felt the drive. She looked at me, her expression shifting from grief to intense confusion. "Get him out of here," Julian urged impatiently from behind. The attendants dragged me out into the night. They shoved me into the back of the van and strapped me onto a gurney. The heavy metal door slammed shut, cutting off the view of the world. The engine roared and the van lurched forward. I closed my eyes and let the sedative take full control. I was heading to a prison, but I'd left the key on the outside. Julian thought he'd buried me, but he didn't realize he'd just handed the shovel to the only person who could dig me out. I woke up to a pungent smell of ammonia and stale urine. My head felt like it was filled with lead, and my brain was stuffed with wet cotton, the side effect of a heavy sedative. I tried to sit up, but my muscles were slow to respond. I blinked, trying to clear the fog. I was in a room barely bigger than a closet. The walls were painted a sickening shade of hospital green, peeling in places. There was nothing but a metal cot bolted to the floor, a pitifully thin mattress, and a stainless steel toilet in the corner without a lid. There were no windows. The only light came from a fluorescent tube behind a wire mesh on the ceiling, buzzing with an irritating hum. This wasn't a real hospital or a high-end care facility. This was a warehouse for waste, a place where wealthy families dumped their unwanted elderly problems to be forgotten, a hidden, unregulated private memory care center. I dragged my heavy body to the edge of the bed and planted my feet on the cold linoleum floor. I wasn't afraid. Fear is a reaction to the unknown, and I knew exactly where I was and why. I was here because I had allowed myself to be brought here. It was the only way to get the evidence into the hands of the one person who mattered. Just dozens of miles away, back in the cabin Julian had tried to condemn, Claire was staring at the small, silver object in her hand. The house was deathly silent. Julian had left the moment he dropped her off. He was rushing to see his lawyer, desperate to file the medical power of attorney and the court order that would give him total control over my assets. He'd left Claire alone with her roiling guilt. She sat on the old couch where I used to read the paper. Her fingers trembled. She remembered the last thing I'd said before being dragged away. "Watch it. You can cry after you see what I've given you." She reached for her laptop, the old machine I'd bought her years ago for college. She plugged the flash drive into the side. A folder popped up. Inside, there was only one video file, simply titled, "The Truth." She hesitated. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Part of her wanted to yank the drive out and throw it into the fireplace. Another part desperately wanted to believe Julian was her savior, and that her father was the villain who'd lost his mind. But the roots of doubt I'd planted ran too deep. She moved the mouse and double-clicked. The video player opened. The angle was from a hidden wide-angle camera, set high up. It was inside the cabin of Julian's SUV. The timestamp in the corner showed it was from 3 days ago, the afternoon he'd come to my cabin to threaten me with the fake lawsuit. Claire held her breath, leaning into the screen. In the video, Julian was driving, but he wasn't alone. Sitting in the passenger seat was a woman Claire had never seen before. She was young, blonde, and laughing recklessly. Her hand was resting on Julian's thigh in a way that left no room for interpretation. "So the old man really has millions?" The woman's voice came through the cheap speakers, sharp and grating. "The commercial valuation of the land alone is $12 million. Julian replied, wearing a look of sickening, smug triumph that Claire didn't recognize. And that's not counting the cash he's hidden in some trust somewhere. The old fool has been sitting on a gold mine while I've been dodging collection calls every day. What about his daughter? The woman asked. Does your wife know? Claire's breathing stopped. She knows now, Julian laughed, his shoulders shaking. But she's an idiot. She's so desperate to be loved, so needy, that she believes whatever I tell her. I told her that old man was losing his marbles, and she bought it hook, line, and sinker. She's pathetic, a total parasite. The woman on the video giggled. What are you going to do once you get the money? Julian reached over with one hand and squeezed the woman's thigh. Once I get the power of attorney and sell the land, I'm kicking Claire to the curb. I'll throw a few grand at her as hush money and file for divorce. She's so annoying, crying all the time, blabbering about her bankrupt dad. I'm sick of her. We'll take the cash, buy a beach house in Miami, and live like royalty. Claire gasped. The air sucked right out of her lungs. She watched in horror as Julian leaned over and gave the woman a long, passionate kiss. In the very car her father had paid off. By the weekend he'll be locked in a mental ward, Julian boasted to his mistress. Once he's locked up and drugged out of his mind, nobody will listen to him again. He'll rot in there and we'll spend his money. Claire slammed the laptop shut. She couldn't watch anymore. She couldn't breathe. A primal, jagged scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was the total collapse of her reality. I was right. Everything I'd said was true. The gambling, the cheating, the embezzlement, the loan sharks. She had betrayed the only man in the world who truly loved her to protect a predator who called her an idiot and a parasite. She curled into a ball on the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. She felt filthy, used, and utterly played. A nauseating clarity hit her. She had signed the legal documents to put her own father in prison based on the lies of a monster. Suddenly keys jingled in the front door. Claire froze. She scrambled to wipe her tears, but it was too late. Julian walked in. He was whistling, a bottle of champagne in his left hand and a thick stack of legal documents in his right. He looked like a winner who just hit the jackpot. "Honey, I'm home," he called out cheerfully. "Guess what? The lawyer says we can fast-track the property transfer. We're going to be multi-millionaires by Friday." He stopped when he saw Claire. He saw her red, swollen eyes. He saw the laptop sitting partially open on the coffee table. He saw the silver USB drive sticking out of the side. The smile vanished from his face. The champagne bottle slowly lowered to his side. The air in the room charged with electric tension. "What are you watching, Claire?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. Claire stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she stood tall. She looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she didn't see her husband. She saw a monster. "You betrayed me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Julian blinked, trying to keep up the charade. "Who told you that? Your crazy old man?" "I saw it with my own eyes," she screamed, pointing at the laptop. "I saw you with her. I heard what you said. You called me an idiot. You said you'd dump me as soon as you got the money. You're trying to steal my father's land to cover your gambling debts." Julian looked at the laptop. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to invent a new lie. He just let go. The champagne bottle hit the thick carpet with a dull thud. It didn't break, just rolled into a corner. The documents scattered across the floor. He lunged forward. He grabbed the laptop and held it high above his head. With a roar of fury, he slammed it down onto the edge of the heavy oak coffee table. The screen shattered. Plastic and glass shards flew across the room. He smashed it again and again, until the machine was nothing but twisted metal and wires. He yanked the USB drive from the mangled port, threw it on the floor, and stomped on it with his heel, crushing it into oblivion. He was panting, staring down at the wreckage. "Now you haven't seen anything. It's your word against mine, sweetheart. Do you think a judge is going to believe you, or a hysterical woman whose father was just committed to an asylum?" "You're insane," Claire cried, backing instinctively toward the kitchen. "I'm calling the police. I'm getting my father out." Julian moved faster than she expected. He grabbed her arm, spun her around, and shoved her hard toward the bedroom. "You aren't calling anyone," he snarled, his face twisted in rage. "You're staying right here. You're going to sit in that room and keep your mouth shut until the land sale goes through. If you even try to step foot out of this house, or call anyone, I'll tell the doctors you're just as crazy as your old man. I'll make sure you end up in the room right next to his." He shoved her onto the bedroom floor and slammed the door shut. Claire heard the lock click from the outside. She threw herself against the wood, pounding and screaming for him to let her out, but he only laughed from the other side. "Stay put, wife," he shouted through the door. "We're at the finish line. The buyer wires the down payment tomorrow, and until then, you won't even see a fly." Dozens of miles away in that cell, the heavy iron door was pushed open from the outside. A bulky attendant walked in, holding a cordless phone. He looked at me with the eyes of someone staring at a dead man. "Your call, old man," he grunted, holding the phone to my ear. I couldn't even raise my arm quickly enough to take it. The drugs had made it feel like lead. "Hello?" My voice was dry as sandpaper. "Hello, Arthur." Julian's light, smug voice came through the line. "How's the vacation going? How's the food?" "You won't get away with this, Julian," I said. "I already have," he sneered. "I'm standing in your cabin right now. I've got the deed, and I've got your medical power of attorney. Oh, and by the way, Claire found your little movie. She didn't like it much, but don't worry, I've taken care of her. For her own safety, she's locked in the bedroom, just like you." My hand slowly balled into a fist at my side. "If you touch a hair on her head—" "What are you going to do, Arthur?" he interrupted without a hint of remorse. "You're locked in a windowless box. You have no power. You're nothing. I have the land, I control your daughter, and you're going to rot there until you die. Goodbye, old man." The line went dead, replaced by a shrill, busy signal. The attendant gave a dismissive snort, took the phone back, and turned to leave. The lock clicked shut behind him with a heavy final thud. I sat in the silence of the cell. Julian thought he'd won. He thought the game was over, but he didn't realize that I hadn't been trapped on the chessboard with him. He was trapped in mine. I looked at the door handle. It was a standard commercial-grade cylindrical lock. I bent down slowly and, from the hem of my dress pants, pulled out a stiff, long piece of wire. I'd unscrewed it from my toolbox and hidden it there days ago, anticipating this very possibility. It was time to check out. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited patiently. Not until the heavy footsteps in the hallway faded into the distance did I stand up. I held the wire in my hand. It was just a piece of scrap metal, but in the hands of an old mechanic who'd spent 40 years fixing heavy-duty truck engines and unjamming conveyor belts, it was a skeleton key. I knelt by the door. The lock was designed to be tamper-proof, but it was no match for precision. I inserted the wire, feeling for the pins. I closed my eyes. I didn't need to see. I needed to feel. In my mind, I mapped the internal mechanics, the tension of the springs and the placement of the shear line. Click, the first pin, click, the second. I applied a tiny amount of torque with my thumb. The third pin was stubborn, but I patiently nudged it into place. The cylinder gave a tiny metallic groan and turned. The sound was the sound of freedom. I pushed the door open an inch. The hallway was dim, the buzzing fluorescent lights flickering from years of neglect. The fat attendant was sitting at the nurse's station about 20 feet away, his back to me. He had his feet up on the desk, scrolling through his phone. He'd clearly been hired for his size, not his skills. I took off my shoes and crept out onto the cold linoleum in my socks, moving without a sound. I didn't run. Running displaces air and creates noise. I moved like a predator, closing the gap before the attendant even realized the air pressure in the room had shifted. He sensed something in the final second. He spun his chair around, dropping his phone. "Hey!" he shouted, starting to rise. "Get back in your room, old man!" His hand reached for the taser on his belt. He was too slow and too arrogant. He saw gray hair and wrinkles, so he assumed I was frail. He didn't see the man who had built a business empire with his bare hands. He didn't see the dock worker who'd spent decades loading cargo in freezing rain until his muscles were as tough as steel cables. I didn't hesitate. Before he could pull the taser, I was inside his guard. He reached to grab my throat. I parried with my left arm and drove a right fist deep into his solar plexus with piston-like precision. It wasn't a flashy cinematic fight. It was a short, lethal strike, fueled by 70 years of gravity and rage. The air was forced out of his lungs in a wet gasp. He doubled over in agony. I didn't give him time to recover. I grabbed the collar of his shirt and his belt, and using the momentum of his own forward lean, slammed him face first into the laminate desk. His skull hit the surface with a sickening thud. He slid to the floor, groaning, completely incapacitated. "Stay down," I growled, my breathing perfectly steady. I ripped the master keyring from his belt. I didn't look back. I strode down the hall, my pace quickening. I passed other rooms, hearing the faint cries of those held captive inside. I promised myself that as soon as I finished my private business, I would tear this hellhole down to the ground, legally. I reached the end of the hallway to a heavy oak door marked Administrative Office. I didn't knock. I shoved the key into the lock and pushed the door open. The office was ridiculously lavish, a stark contrast to the decay outside. Persian rugs, a mahogany desk, the smell of expensive cigars. Sitting behind the desk was the director of the facility, Dr. Aris. He was currently counting a thick stack of cash, clearly a bribe Julian had paid him to sign the forged medical report. He jumped, scattering $100 bills across the desk. "Who are you?" he demanded, wide-eyed. "How did you get out? Security!" I swung the door shut and engaged the deadbolt. "Sit down," I ordered. Dr. Aris's eyes darted toward the desk phone. "Don't even think about it," I said, walking toward him. "I'll be over this desk before you dial the first number. And I promise you, I won't be as gentle as I was with your orderly." He slumped back into his leather chair, turning pale. "Look, Mr. Arthur, let's talk about this. Your son-in-law paid for the premium package. We're just following the family's medical directives." "My son-in-law paid for nothing," I said, slamming my hands onto the desk and looming over him. "He paid you with money stolen from credit cards and loan sharks. But that isn't the biggest problem you're facing right now." "Then what do you want?" he stammered. "Your biggest problem," I said coldly, "is that you didn't do a background check before taking that blood money." "I know who you are," Eris blurted out. "You're Arthur, a retired old man with advanced Alzheimer's. Your son-in-law has valid court documents." I reached into my pocket, pulled out my rugged encrypted phone, and slapped it onto the desk, right next to his pile of dirty cash. "Look at the wall behind you," I ordered. Iris turned his head. Hanging in the center of a wall covered in vanity degrees and industry awards was a massive bronze plaque, inscribed with the name of the facility's founding donor. "Read the name at the top," my voice echoed in the room. Iris squinted, swallowing hard. "The Eleanor King Charitable Trust." "Eleanor was my wife," I said, every word hitting him like a hammer. "The only reason this facility exists is because I wrote a $3 million check 10 years ago to set up a blind trust, intended to give seniors with cognitive impairments a dignified place to live. I hold the deed to this entire plot of land. I am the man who signs your paycheck." Iris spun back to look at me, his eyes fixed. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, all the blood draining from his face until he looked like a corpse pulled from the morgue. The realization hit him like a runaway freight train. The man he'd been bribed to imprison, the man he'd falsely diagnosed, was the very man who owned the keys to his entire existence. "My God," he whispered in despair. "Mr. Arthur, sir, I really didn't know. The documents look completely legal. Your son-in-law said you—" "The documents were forgeries," I cut him off, my voice sharp. "And you, doctor, are finished. You're looking at federal prison for kidnapping, medical fraud, and elder abuse. I'm not just going to personally see to it that your medical license is revoked. I'm going to make sure you never even qualify to work as an orderly again." I picked up the handset of his desk phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was answered on the first ring. "Ms. Steinberg?" I said to my lead corporate attorney. She was a ruthless woman who could dissect a person using nothing but contract clauses. "It's time. Initiate the trap protocol. Submit the evidence we've collected regarding Julian Vance's money laundering through shell companies and the SEC wire fraud to the FBI. Then send a car for me immediately." I paused, glancing at Dr. Aris, who had gone limp in his chair. "I'm at the Memory Care Center." Aris was trembling, tears streaming down his face. "Sir, please," he begged. "I have a wife and children at home." "So do I," I said, looking at him with cold, pitiless eyes. "And my family is currently being held hostage by a psychopath because of your greed." I hung up and straightened my jacket, which had wrinkled during the scuffle. Julian thought that holding a ridiculous power of attorney form meant he held all the cards. He thought locking me in here meant he could sit back and count his stolen money. But he didn't realize he had just taken the final step toward the cliff's edge, and below it lay the abyss I had prepared for him. I ordered Dr. Aris to stand up. He slid out of his leather chair like a pile of boneless jelly, his legs shaking uncontrollably. I didn't touch him. I just guided him out of the cigar-scented office with a cold, piercing glare. The night nurse at the front desk saw me, an old man who was supposed to be locked in a high-security dementia ward, escorting her boss out with nothing but sheer presence, and she was so terrified she dropped her phone. I ignored her and pushed through the glass doors of the facility. The night air outside carried the scent of Oregon pine. The gravel driveway was clear of that shady transport van. In its place stood 3 black Lincoln Navigators, engines humming with a low, authoritative rumble. There were no flashy insignias on the doors, but it was a display of absolute power. Standing by the lead vehicle was Ms. Steinberg. Behind her stood men in dark suits, not mere bodyguards, but former tactical team members I kept on high retainer for my most volatile negotiations. Ms. Steinberg didn't glance at Dr. Aris, who was sobbing on the stairs. She walked up to me in her heels, handing me a fresh, charcoal-gray, bespoke suit jacket and a tablet. "Mr. Arthur," she said briskly, "the FBI's Financial Crimes Division has fast-tracked our report. Furthermore, the sheriff and his deputies will be here in 3 minutes. They have an arrest warrant for Dr. Aris, along with an emergency court order stripping Julian of his power of attorney." I shed the tweed jacket I'd worn during the scuffle and put on the perfectly tailored suit. The weight and texture of the fabric made me feel like I was finally stepping out of the shell of the bankrupt old man. "Well done, Miss Steinberg." I watched the red and blue police lights flickering in the distance and gave a command to my head of security. "Hand Aris over to the police, then take me back to my cabin. We have some trash left to clean up." Miles away at the cabin, the air was thick with stale sweat and the smell of impending violence. Julian Vance had devolved from a desperate gambler into a man completely unhinged. He'd ripped the phone cord from the wall, deadbolted the front door, and trapped Claire inside the sanctuary I'd built to protect her. Claire sat at the rough oak dining table, her body shaking so hard the chair creaked against the floorboards. The quitclaim deed, soaked in her tears, lay before her. Julian slammed his hand on the table, making the inkwell jump. "Sign it!" he roared, his voice cracking from panic. "You have his medical power of attorney now. You can keep him locked in that asylum, and as his legal agent, you can sign for him. Sign the paper." "I can't!" Claire sobbed into her hands. "It's illegal, Julian. It's fraud. He didn't agree to give you the land. You just had him locked up in that horrible place. He's as good as dead." Julian leaned in, his face contorted into a mask of fury. "He's trapped in a hole without windows. He's never coming out. It's just us now, Claire. We need this money. The loan sharks are hunting me down, you understand. They'll break my legs, and they'll come for you, too." He grabbed a serrated steak knife from the table, yanked Claire by her hair, and forced her head back, pressing the cold, sharp blade against her soft throat. "Sign the document." He was breathing like a beast, his eyes bloodshot. "Sign it, or I swear I'll slit your throat right now. I have nothing left to lose, and I don't mind killing you and telling the cops it was your escaped psycho father. They'll believe me. Everyone thinks he's crazy." Just as Claire's hand trembled toward the pen to trade her life for a signature, the world outside the cabin exploded in blinding light. High-intensity tactical floodlights pierced the thin curtains, turning the living room into high noon. The sound of heavy-duty off-road tires crushing gravel hit like rolling thunder. Julian froze, the blade still pressed against Claire's neck. "What is that?" He squinted, trying to see through the window. "Is it the cops?" The front door wasn't knocked upon. It was physically destroyed. With a deafening boom, the lock, the frame, and the old oak planks burst inward. Wood splinters flew through the air like shrapnel. 2 heavily armed deputy sheriffs and my private security team stormed in with speed too fast for the naked eye. They weren't movie brawlers. They were professionals executing a court order. Julian didn't even have time to scream before the first officer's tactical baton struck his wrist with a sickening crunch of bone. The steak knife clattered to the floor. The second officer swept his legs out from under him and pinned him face down to the hardwood floor, a knee driven firmly into his spine. Claire scrambled back until her spine hit the wall. "Stay down!" the officer roared at Julian. Julian writhed on the floor, mouth bloody, shouting in confusion. "Who are you? What gives you the right to break in here? I am the legal owner." The dust in the cabin settled, and the room went dead silent. The security team parted, clearing a path. I walked into the cabin, leaning on a brass-top cane. It wasn't to support a frail body, but as a symbol of authority. I was wearing my custom Italian suit, my shoes polished to a high sheen, my silk tie knotted in a perfect Windsor. I was no longer the hunched old man in a worn jacket. I walked like a king issuing a decree. I stood in the center of the wreckage. I looked at the shattered vase, my terrified daughter in the corner, and finally down at Julian, pinned to the floor like a cockroach. "Good evening, Julian," I said, my voice low and calm, yet possessing and crushing weight. Julian strained his neck to see my face. His eyes widened until they nearly bulged from their sockets. He blinked frantically, trying to reconcile the bankrupt old man he'd thrown into an unmarked van with the tycoon standing before him. "Arthur," he gasped. "How? You're supposed to be in the memory care center. You're broke." I tapped my cane lightly against the floor, a sharp, resonant sound. "I'm not Arthur," I said coldly. "Arthur was a character I played to test you, a test you failed miserably." I signaled the security team. They hauled Julian to his feet and forced him to his knees before me. He was shaking, mucus and cold sweat streaming down his cheeks. He looked at my suit, the professional security team, the line of luxury cars outside. "Who the hell are you?" he screamed hysterically, his grip on logic shattering. "You're a loser nobody." I leaned in close to his face, making sure he heard every syllable. "I am the CEO who signed the checks that fired you. I am the majority shareholder of the private bank that holds the mortgage on your apartment. I am the absolute owner of the land you are currently kneeling on. And now I am the man who will legally and permanently end your social existence." Julian shook his head frantically. No, that's impossible. You're just a truck mechanic." 40 years ago, I was a truck mechanic, I corrected him. "But today, I am the man behind Pendleton Logistics. And you, Julian, are a felon suspected of wire fraud, a kidnapper who held an elderly man against his will, and a failed con artist." I looked at Claire. She stared at me, mouth agape. Her tears dried on her cheeks. She saw the suit, the power. For the first time in her life, she didn't see her father as a weakling who needed protecting, but as an unstoppable force of nature. "Dad," she whispered. I turned my gaze back to Julian. I held out my hand to Ms. Steinberg, who immediately handed the tablet to Julian. "You wanted my money? You wanted my power," I said, my tone void of warmth. "Now open your eyes and see what power really looks like. Power isn't holding a steak knife to a defenseless woman. Power is making a man vanish from society without ever raising your voice." The tablet displayed a live feed. It was an unmarked warehouse in the Portland Industrial District, the one Julian had leased using his shell company. On the screen, heavily armed FBI agents were cutting through the warehouse doors, revealing stacks of smuggled counterfeit goods and servers used for money laundering. "You're done, Julian," I said. "You have no job, no money, no wife. From this moment on, you don't even have your freedom. Officer, get him out of my house." The deputies dragged Julian away. He screamed and cursed the whole way, but his voice sounded small and pathetic in the face of absolute law and capital. As he was shoved into the back of the cruiser, I turned and held out my hand to Claire. She hesitated for a second, then lunged into my arms, sobbing. I held her tight, her tears soaking into the silk of my suit. The war was over, but the long process of cleaning up the battlefield had just begun. Narcissists like Julian Vance are like resilient cockroaches. You step on them, spray them, and they still find a crack to crawl back into the dark. I thought the FBI raid and the federal wire fraud charges would be the end, but I had underestimated the blind love of parents. His respectable parents, living in the suburbs and oblivious to the truth, had mortgaged their retirement home to post his bail. 48 hours later, he was out. For a criminal facing a maximum of 20 years, the smart move would be to stay silent, call a lawyer, and prep a plea deal. But Julian didn't do that. He did what narcissists do. He tried to manipulate the court of public opinion. The next night, I turned on the living room TV. A local news station famous for digging up scandals was airing a special interview. On screen, Julian wore a clearly borrowed cheap suit, looking haggard and pathetic. He sobbed into the camera, his acting flawless. "My father-in-law is not the man he claims to be," Julian wept to the sensationalist news anchor. "He claims to be a legitimate businessman, but he's actually a mob boss. He has underworld ties. He kidnapped my wife. He held her hostage in that cabin. Those security guards, they're his private hit squad." The anchor leaned in, sympathy written all over her face. "Mr. Vance, what about the FBI's charges against you? About smuggling and money laundering?" "It's all framed." Julian wiped his eyes emphatically. "He hacked my computers, forged the documents. He has billions in assets. He can buy off the police, buy off judges. I'm just a regular working guy. I just wanted to protect my wife, and he used his privilege to destroy me. Please, if anyone is watching, save Claire, save my wife." The public loves a commoner versus evil billionaire narrative. Social media exploded. In less than an hour, #JusticeForJulian and #SaveClaire were trending. Some blind protesters even started gathering outside my gates, shouting and calling me a predatory capitalist. They didn't see a father protecting his daughter. They only saw a billionaire abusing his power. Claire sat in the corner of the couch, shaking her head in shock. "He's just so good at lying," she said weakly. "He's not good at lying. He's desperate." I picked up my phone, and desperation makes men careless. I dialed my lawyer. "Ms. Steinberg, prep a press conference. Notify every major news outlet. Global broadcast in 30 minutes. Don't find a venue. Let them onto my driveway." I walked onto the porch. The protesters and news crews outside the gates were growing by the minute. I didn't back down, and I didn't hide. I gestured to the security team. "Open the gate and let them in," I commanded. Reporters surged in with cameras and mics. They expected a fortress or an arrogant tycoon refusing to admit fault. Instead, they saw a 70-year-old man standing on the porch of a dilapidated cabin, holding his daughter's hand. Behind me, my tech team had set up a massive LED screen. "Mr. Arthur," a reporter shouted, thrusting a mic forward, "are you holding your daughter against her will? How do you respond to Julian Vance's accusations?" I didn't answer. I just pointed my cane at the screen behind me. It lit up, not with an edited clip, but with a split-screen feed. On the left, official FBI body cam footage from the warehouse raid, revealing stacks of synthetic opioids and forged financial records. On the right, Julian signed shell company lease agreements and official bank statements, tracing every cent of dirty money. "Julian Vance claims I am a criminal." I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing across the courtyard, drowning out the questions. "He claims I forged evidence, but what you are seeing now are legally obtained financial records from the federal government, with every cent traced to his biometric verification. He wasn't selling logistics services. He was using Pendleton logistics containers to smuggle contraband. He used that dirty money to cover his gambling debts in Vegas." Claire stepped forward, standing at the mic. She was still trembling, but her eyes were firm. "My husband is not a victim." She spoke to the camera, her voice clear and forceful. "He is a predator. My father didn't kidnap me. He rescued me from a con man. Julian Vance just lied to all of you on national television, just like he lied to me." Back in the suburbs, in his parents' house, Julian slumped on the couch, the remote slipping from his hand. He watched the live broadcast, seeing his house of lies collapse in high definition. He heard the news anchor interrupt. "Breaking news. The FBI has just issued a nationwide warrant for Julian Vance. Due to multiple transnational felony charges and a high flight risk, he is considered armed and dangerous. If seen, call the police immediately." Julian scrambled off the couch, knocking over his mother's coffee table. His parents, who had mortgaged their home, stared at him in horror, finally realizing their son was an irredeemable fraud. "I have to go," Julian stammered, grabbing the keys and sprinting out the back door. He jumped into his mother's old sedan and cranked the ignition. Wailing sirens approached in the distance. They were coming. Not just the police. The loan sharks who had seen the news were definitely hunting him now. He slammed on the gas, the car screeching out of the driveway to begin a flight he was destined to lose. Julian drove like a man possessed, tearing through the streets of Portland. He blew through 3 red lights, sideswiped a delivery truck, and left his side mirror hanging by a wire. His world had shrunk to the size of a prison cell. His phone buzzed endlessly in the cup holder, stranger after stranger, creditor after creditor. He needed an exit. He needed cash. He needed a ticket out of the country. He ran through every contact in his head, but every one of them had blocked his number. There was only one person left, someone who might help him, if only out of fear. He dialed Richard Hayes. "Pick up, you coward! Answer me!" He pounded the steering wheel. After 3 rings, the line connected. "Hello, Julian." Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "Hayes, listen, I know you fired me, but you have to help. I have backups of the company's offshore shipping manifests. If I go down, I'm dragging you with me. I'll tell the SEC that the firm is cooking the books." He was bluffing. The bait program I'd planted had nuked his computer days ago. He had nothing. But desperation made him believe his own lies. "I need 50,000 in cash," Julian roared, "and a boat. Get me out of this country, and you'll never hear from me again." Silence hung on the other end. Then a faint electronic click. The audio quality shifted. "You're on speaker, Julian." A deep, authoritative, and terrifyingly familiar voice echoed through the cabin. Julian's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice. It was the man who had dismantled his life piece by piece. "Arthur," he whispered. "It's Mr. Arthur," I corrected him. "And you have nothing, Julian. Those files you think you downloaded, they were honeypot traps I wrote myself 10 years ago. Go ahead and call the SEC. They're already busy looking for you." "You ruined me!" Julian screamed, spit flying onto the wheel. "You took everything." "You ruined yourself the day you decided to become a criminal," I said calmly. "But I'm in a generous mood today. I'll give you one last chance." Julian's heart skipped a beat. "What?" "I'm giving you a head start," I said. "I know where you are. I'm tracking your phone. The police are blocking off the North District, but the South Bridge is still clear. If you can make it to the old shipyard at the Port of Portland in 5 minutes, there's a freighter bound for Panama. I have a contact there. 5 minutes, Julian. The clock is ticking." The line went dead. Julian didn't think about why I'd help him. He didn't even suspect a trap. A drowning man will grab at anything. He checked the GPS. The South Bridge was exactly 10 minutes away. He had to gamble. He floored the gas, the old sedan wailing in agony as it wove recklessly through traffic. He smashed through the rusted chain-link fence of the shipyard, his tires screaming against the concrete, and skidded to a halt beside a mountain of shipping containers. He jumped out, sprinting toward the edge of the dock, his heart bursting with hope. No freighter, no captain waiting for him, just the cold sea breeze and the creaking of rusted steel in the dark. Julian froze, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. But behind him, he didn't hear police sirens. He heard the muffled thud of car doors closing. A matte black Land Rover sat in the shadows of the containers. The headlights flashed on, blinding him. 2 men in leather jackets stepped out, holding metal baseball bats. Julian knew them. They were the cleanup crew for the underground casino, and he owed their boss $200,000. "Look at what we have here," the man with the bat sneered, stepping forward. "We got an anonymous tip that a little rat trying to skip town would be at the docks tonight. You're all over the news, and you've made our boss look bad." No, please, I can pay. I just need time." Julian raised his hands, backing away. "You're out of time, Julian." The man raised the bat and swung. The first strike shattered Julian's left kneecap. He let out a shriek that echoed across the docks, collapsing onto the concrete. The second strike broke his ribs. He curled into a ball, shielding his head, rolling in agony and praying for mercy that didn't exist. In the underworld, there is no bankruptcy protection, only blood debts. Just when he thought they would beat him to death, red and blue lights finally tore through the night. Police cruisers screeched into the yard. The thugs dropped their bats and vanished into the labyrinth of containers. Officers drew their weapons, approaching the bloodied man with caution. "Julian Vance, you're under arrest." Julian lay there, face covered in blood, struggling for air, but as he looked at the officers, there was no fear in his eyes, only profound relief. He let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Thank you," he whispered to the officer cuffing him. "Thank you. Lock me up. Don't let them find me again." As they dragged him into the squad car, he caught a glimpse, through the window, of a silhouette standing on a high gantry crane, a man in a suit, leaning on a cane. He knew it was the long-overdue justice I had delivered. In the private hospital room, the air smelled of sharp antiseptic, a stark contrast to the brilliant sunshine outside. Claire lay in bed, looking frail. Days of interrogation, media bombardment, and emotional collapse had left her severely dehydrated and fragile. I sat in the chair by her bed, holding a paring knife, focused on peeling a red apple in one long, continuous spiral. The only sound in the room was the soft shh of the blade against the fruit. I didn't speak, didn't lecture. I just sat there, acting like the father she'd long forgotten. Claire shifted, struggling to prop herself up against the pillows. She glanced at me and then quickly looked away, staring at the white sheets. The shame she carried was heavy enough to choke on. "You should hate me," she rasped. I sliced a piece of apple and held it out. She shook her head. "I don't hate you, Claire," I said softly. "I signed them." She choked, tears spilling over. "I signed those papers and put you in an asylum. I let them drag you from your own home. I chose a monster just because he bought me expensive gifts and whispered sweet things. I was so stupid. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." She covered her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. This was the apology I'd been waiting for, but it brought no joy. Watching my daughter broken was a tragedy I'd tried so hard to avoid. "You weren't stupid, Claire." I put the knife down. "You were blinded. That's what love does. It puts a filter on the world. You saw the fairy tale you wanted to see, and Julian was a master of disguise." "But you knew," she cried. "You knew what he was all along. Why didn't you stop me sooner? Why let it go this far?" I leaned forward, clasping my hands over my knees. "Because you wouldn't have listened. If I'd told you 6 months ago that your husband was an embezzling thief, would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was just a jealous, bitter old man trying to ruin your happiness? If I'd torn down every wall before you hit it, how would you have learned to climb? You had to see the ugliness for yourself, Claire. And unfortunately, monsters only take off their masks when they think they've won." Claire looked at me, her eyes full of pain and confusion, the question she'd been harboring for so long. "Why did you pretend to be poor, Dad? Why hide the money? If I'd known you were a billionaire, none of this would have happened." "That's exactly why I had to hide it." I stood up and walked to the window, watching the Portland skyline. "When your mother died, I realized something terrifying. I realized my money could buy anything in the world, but it couldn't buy character, loyalty, or real love. I looked at my wealthy friends, and they'd raised spoiled, entitled heirs. Those people get married, and their partners love their bank accounts, not their souls. I was never going to let that happen to you." I turned back to look her in the eye. "I wanted you to be loved because you were you, not because you were the heiress to Pendleton Logistics. If I'd waved my checkbook around, Julian would have married you anyway and faster. He would have played the perfect son-in-law, smiling and obedient, waiting patiently for me to die so he could inherit the empire. You would never have known he was a viper until he'd already sunk his fangs into you. By hiding who I was, I forced him to show who he was. He thought you had no safety net, thought you were a pauper, so he treated you like garbage he could discard. Claire, that is the only way to measure a man. You don't look at how he treats a CEO who can do him a favor. You look at how he treats a person he thinks is useless." Claire listened in silence. The truth finally settled in her heart. Poverty had been the filter. It was the test Julian had failed miserably. "He never loved me," she said quietly. "He just wanted a ladder to climb. When he realized the ladder was broken, he wanted to crush me." I walked back to the bed and took her cold hand. "He loved the vanity you provided, but it's over. He's in the cage where he belongs, and you are here, and you are safe." Claire looked at our joined hands. "I don't know what to do next, Dad. I have nothing left. The condo is seized. I lost my job because of the scandal. I'm 28, and I have nothing but a disgraced ex-husband and a broken heart." "You have one thing that is incredibly precious," I corrected her. "You have a blank slate." I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Claire instinctively flinched, perhaps expecting jewelry or another harsh lesson. I opened the bag and spilled the contents into her palm. It was a plain brass key. "This isn't a mansion, and it isn't $1 million handout," I said. "It's a studio apartment in Brooklyn, New York. 4th floor, no elevator. But it's a safe neighborhood, and I've already paid the year's rent." Claire stared at the key, bewildered. "Are you kicking me out?" "I'm sending you to find yourself," I said. "In this city, you will always be the girl who married the con man, and you will always be the billionaire's daughter. But in New York, you're just Claire. No one knows you, and no one cares who your father is." I handed her a business card. "This is a friend of mine. She runs a non-profit gallery in Brooklyn. You always loved to paint, until Julian told you it was a waste of time. She needs an assistant. It's minimum wage. You'll have to budget, and you'll have to ride the subway. It will be hard, but it will be your work and your life." Claire gripped the key tightly. She looked at me, tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of relief. "You're really not going to give me millions?" she asked with a bitter but light-hearted smile. I smiled back. "I'm giving you the same thing I gave Julian. Independence. But the difference is I know you'll use it well. When I die, or when you prove you no longer need the money, the wealth will be yours naturally. Until then, go live. Go make your own mistakes. Go find a man who would love you even if you were penniless." She sat up, wrapped her arms around me, and buried her face in my shoulder. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for saving me." I kissed her hair. "I didn't save you, Claire. I just opened the cage door. You have to do the flying yourself." 1 year later, in the visiting room of the Oregon State Maximum Security Prison, the heavy bulletproof door clicked shut behind me with a sickening mechanical snap. Exactly 365 days had passed since the banquet, since the night Julian tried to take everything. The air here was forever perfumed with industrial cleanser and despair, the kind of smell that clings to the clothes of anyone who enters. I sat on the hard plastic stool on my side of the glass. I adjusted the gold cufflinks on my French-cuffed shirt. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, they refracted a cold, hard glare. When the guard brought Julian out, I barely recognized him. The man who sat down wasn't the arrogant sales director in the white tuxedo. He was a ghost. His head was shaved, revealing ugly scars from fights. His skin had a sickly, waxy yellow hue, and he looked 30 pounds lighter. His orange jumpsuit hung off his skeletal frame like an empty sack. He sat down slowly, wincing with every movement, as if his body were a map of bruises and fractures. At first, he didn't look at me. He stared at his calloused, trembling hands. Then he picked up the black receiver. I picked up mine. "Hello, Julian." He looked up. His eyes had lost their spark. The fire of greed that once drove him had burned out. But when he saw my bespoke suit and the Patek Philippe on my wrist, a deep, venomous spark flickered in his gaze. "You came?" he rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. "I promised I would," I replied calmly. He let out a dry, wretched laugh. "You came to show off, to look at the animal in the cage. Does it make you feel accomplished, Arthur? Seeing me like this, do you feel like an invincible god?" I looked at him, feeling nothing. No triumph, no pity. He was just a bad debt in the ledger of my life, a failed investment I'd written off long ago. "I didn't come to show off, Julian," I said, my voice low. "I came to see if you'd learned anything." "Learned?" He spat at the glass and leaned in. "I learned that in this world, rich people can buy anything. I learned the system is rigged by people like you. You set me up. You baited me. You set yourself up, I corrected him. You dug the hole, Julian. I just handed you the shovel. You had a high-paying job, a wife who loved you, and a bright future. But that wasn't enough for you. You wanted wealth you didn't work for. He slammed his fist against the bulletproof glass with a dull thud. I was owed it. I worked my tail off for those clients, and you had tens of millions buried in the dirt. Speaking of dirt, tell me, Arthur, what happened to the land? Did you sell it? Did you get the 12 million? Does it feel good spending money that should have been mine? I leaned back and crossed my legs. This was the final moment, the last nail in the coffin of his soul. I didn't sell the land, Julian. He froze, blinking in confusion. What? I didn't sell it, and I didn't keep it, I repeated. His brow furrowed tightly. Then what did you do with it? That was prime real estate. You said so yourself. I donated it, I said flatly. Julian went rigid. He seemed to forget how to breathe. Donated? Every acre, the whole thing, I continued, as if reciting a mundane balance sheet. I transferred the title 6 months ago. The old cabin was demolished last month. Construction crews are already on site, and the project has begun. What project? He whispered, a nameless horror spreading across his face. The Eleanor King Home for Children. I looked him in the eye. When it's finished, it will be the largest orphanage and foster support center in the entire state of Oregon. It will house 200 homeless children. It will give them an education, food, and the chance for a fresh start that you once had and destroyed with your own hands. No. Julian opened his mouth, gasping for air. No, you threw $12 million away on orphans? You're lying. You just want to torture me. I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, unfolding it against the glass. It was a copy of the bronze plaque from the groundbreaking ceremony. Read it, Julian. He squinted. His eyes scanned the black printed letters. In memory of Eleanor King. Land donated in full by Mr. Arthur King. Market valuation, $12,500,000. The phone handset slipped from his hand, dangling by the cord and banging against the wall. He stared at me, mouth agape, letting out a soundless, agonizing wail. For a man like Julian, losing money was painful, but knowing that the money had been thrown away, wasted on charity, spent on people who would never give him a return, that was the ultimate torture. It shattered his worldview. His brain couldn't comprehend a world where a person valued character over cash. He grabbed the receiver, his hands trembling violently. You're a lunatic, he shrieked into the phone. You're a psychopath. That money could have saved me. That money could have bought me a new life. And you gave it to that bottom-of-the-barrel trash. Those children are not trash. My voice turned cold as iron, possessing a terrifying weight. They are the future. You, Julian, you are the trash. You thought if you had enough zeros in your bank account, you'd be a king. But you forgot the most important law of business and of life. I leaned forward, my gaze piercing his fear-filled pupils. Like a blade. Your net worth will never define your self-worth. You are in that cage because you are morally bankrupt, and no amount of money could ever provide bail for your rotting soul. I hung up. Julian began to scream hysterically. He slammed his fists against the glass, cursing me, cursing Claire, cursing the world. 2 guards rushed in, grabbing his shoulders from behind. They dragged him away, his heels scraping against the floor, his shrieks fading into the darkness as the heavy iron doors slammed shut. I watched him go. I didn't smile, and I didn't frown. I simply stood up, buttoned my jacket, turned around, and left the man who tried to destroy my family behind forever. He was nothing but a footnote now. I walked out of the visiting room, through the checkpoints. The heavy metal doors buzzed behind me, one after another, releasing me back into the world. I stepped out of the prison's main gate into the bright afternoon sun. The air tasted sweet. It was the smell of clean. Parked at the curb was the black Navigator. Richard Hayes stood by the rear door, checking his watch. Seeing me approach, a respectful smile touched his lips. Meeting went well, Chairman? He asked as he opened the door for me. Very productive, I replied. The account has been completely liquidated. Richard nodded. Excellent. The board is waiting for you, Mr. King. The merger with the European shipping firm is on the desk. No one is making a move without your final signature. I took one last look at the gray, ugly prison. It was a monument to bad choices. In my mind's eye, I saw the cabin in the woods, Claire preparing her first solo art show in her Brooklyn studio, and the orphanage rising from the dirt. I turned and sat in the car. The leather seats were cool and comfortable. "Let's go, Richard," I said. "We have work to do." The car pulled away, gliding silently onto the highway. I took out my phone, the latest model, the one Claire insisted I buy so we could FaceTime anytime. I opened my schedule, a board meeting at 2 p.m., a charity gala at 6 p.m., and a call with my daughter at 9 p.m. I am Arthur King. I am 70 years old, and my life is just beginning. In the end, this storm wasn't just about saving my daughter from a disastrous marriage. It was about saving her from a superficial life. I learned that you can give your children everything in the world, but if you don't teach them to value character over currency, you've given them nothing at all. Julian thought power was about intimidation and excess. He learned too late that true power is the quiet of deep water. It is the absolute discipline to stand your ground when the whole world underestimates you. Never let the noise of status drown out the quiet echoes of integrity. Money comes and goes, but when the dust settles, all you have left is your name. Keep it clean.